When discussing the history of South Italy before Rome, the focus is often on the Greeks of Magna Graecia. They had massive influence on this region, which can even be seen to this day. But a less often discussed aspect of this region are the native Italians of the region, one of which I will focus on today, the Lucanians. The region later known as Lucania was originally inhabited by the Apennine culture, much like Etruria, and the rest of the Italian peninsula. In the 7th century BC, however, the Lucanians from the mountainous regions of central Italy began a slow migration towards the southern coast. This goes against the more traditional narrative of a single large-scale invasion in favor of a more broad, sweeping demographic shift. This slow migration was most likely due to the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia who, due to their low populations, often hired mercenaries. As anyone who knows about the Roman Samnite Wars would tell you, the Italians from the mountainous regions made for remarkable warriors. In the 6th century, there is even evidence of cohabitation in the Greek colony of Poseidonia, which would later be called Paestum by the Romans. Working as mercenaries, merchants, and laborers, a sizable native Italian population grew within the city. Eventually, Lucanian nobles were of great importance to the city, and by the 5th century, it became a Lucanian city in all but name. This cohabitation also goes against the traditional narrative, which describes, yet again, an invasion by the Lucanians to take the city. This is when it becomes important to note that the ancient sources for this period are written hundreds of years after the fact, in the wake of the Second Punic War. Writers were mostly Roman and were interested in answering the question, why did this all happen? As such, there is a heavy amount of Roman centrism, which only recently has been challenged by new archaeological finds. With that being said, certain aspects of their culture have survived. The Lucanians are a South Oscan-speaking people. This makes them cousins to other cultures from the Italian interior, such as the Samnites, who played an important role in the early history of Rome. The region known as Lucania differs from the mountains quite substantially. Characterized by extremely fertile valleys and plains, it became a major exporter of food, as well as draft horses who worked the fields across Italy and Greece. Large forests gave way to a sizable lumber industry and, due to its proximity to the coast, was vital in providing lumber for the construction of ships during the Roman period. These forests were also home to countless wild boar, which provided the Lucanians and later Romans ample grounds for hunting. Above all else, in the minds of ancient historians, were the Lucanians as warriors. They could field massive armies for their time, numbering 30 to 40,000 infantry and 3 to 4,000 horsemen. Simple agriculture and lumber could no doubt be unsustainable for such massive armies, and the Lucanians often made money through war, whether that meant by working as mercenaries or looting defeated cities. Their numbers and aptitude for war made them the most influential Italian people in the south until the arrival of the Romans, but they did not always act as a single unit. In the 6th and the early 5th centuries, the Lucanian people identified less with their fellow Lucanians and more with their local communities, much like the Greeks or the Etruscans did with their city-states. This fragmentary nature allowed for cultural diversity, which normally manifested by outside cultural osmosis. This came chiefly from the Greeks, but the Romans and Etruscans were also sources of influence. For example, some Lucanian writing survives to this day, but no Oscan script exists. Instead, they used various types of Greek alphabet, and in places with substantial Roman influence, they used the Latin alphabet. The Etruscans, for their part, imparted certain funerary traditions such as tomb paintings and sports. The Greeks also imparted many aspects of religion, although this is mostly done in areas in which they had already shared many similarities. Certain Lucanian cities even experimented with civic government, like those in the Greek cities and in Rome. They were not merely a tribe, as the Romans and Greeks make them out to be, but a fully fledged civilization. The 4th century is when the Lucanians came into the Roman historians' narrative in force. This century is characterized by many external wars fought between them and all of their neighbors. This was the period which cements the Lucanians as a wider people rather than just their local communities, and is when the largest Lucanian armies were raised. It was a period of extreme instability, as allies and enemies were constantly changing. For example, they often fought against the Greek city of Tarentum, such as in the campaign of Alexander I of Epirus, but would later ally with them during the campaign of Pyrrhus of Epirus against Rome. They were allied with Rome in the Samnite Wars, the First Punic Wars, and Roman-Gallic Wars, but fought against them in the Pyrrhic War and the Second Punic War. The fact that they could so readily pick and choose who their allies and enemies were speaks to the overall power and influence of the Lucanians, rather than just being subjected to the whims of nearby superpowers. This could not be sustained, however, and after the Second Punic War in the late 3rd century BC, the Lucanians were weakened, which led to their integration into the Roman Republic. Many of the smaller population centers were abandoned in favor of a few large cities such as Grumentum, Venusia, and Potentia. The rest essentially returned to agriculture, and the process of Romanization began. For the Romans, this was no easy task. Many of the new Roman elite could trace their origins back to the Lucanians, and a distinct Lucanian identity acted as a counterbalance to Roman efforts. In the 1st century BC, they rose up in the social war along with many other Italian people, but were eventually defeated. It is often claimed that the reign of Augustus in the late 1st century BC was the end of unique Italian regional identities, but it did not end as easy as some people may have you believe. It was really a string of slow and gradual changes, which has since been coined the Long Goodbye. Like many civilizations across history, the Lucanians would go out after a long and protracted period of cultural erasure. So, while the Lucanians do not survive as a cultural identity to this day, they still have left an important mark in the history of southern Italy and Rome as a whole. They acted as an important counterbalance between the Romans, Greeks, and Italians, all of which had experienced fighting both with and against them. And while they did not survive as an independent people, they influenced Rome itself with a new patrician elite who were able to use their heritage to leverage power within the complex web that is Roman politics. So while they may not be the flashiest or the most long-lived Mediterranean cultures, I still find them an interesting topic, and I hope you did too.